The 20th, Colonel Wilkes, being on the eve of his departure for Europe, called with his daughter to take leave of the Emperor. The young lady was presented to Madame Bertrand. I have already mentioned that Colonel Wilkes had formerly been governor of the colony for the East India Company. He was succeeded by the admiral in the king's name when, in consequence of our removal to St. Helena, the island was transferred from the possession of the company to that of the government. The emperor was in a remarkably cheerful humor. He conversed for some time with the ladies, and then took Colonel Wilkes aside to the recess of one of the windows, whither I followed to serve as interpreter. Colonel Wilkes, as I have probably mentioned before, was for a long time the diplomatic agent of the company in the Indian Peninsula. He has written a history of those regions. He is a man of extensive information and possesses great knowledge of chemistry. Thus, he was at once a soldier, an author, a diplomatist, and a chemist. The emperor put questions to him relative to all these subjects and treated them himself with great fluency and spirit. The conversation was lively and varied, and it was maintained for upwards of 2 hours. The following are the principal particulars which I noted down. I shall probably in some measure repeat what I have said before, but the emperor and Colonel Wilkes had some months ago a long conversation on precisely the same topics, but that is of no importance. These subjects are so interesting that I would rather incur the risk of repeating than of losing anything connected with them. The emperor began by speaking of the English army, its organization, and particularly its system of promotion. He compared it with the French army and repeated what I formerly stated with regard to the excellent composition of our military force, the advantage of the conscription, and the bravery of our troops. Then, turning to the subject of politics, he said, "You lost America by affranchisement. You will lose India by invasion. The first loss is perfectly natural. As children advance in years, they break their parental bonds. But for the Hindus, they are not advancing at all. They still remain children. The catastrophe, therefore, can only proceed from without. You are not aware of all the dangers with which you were threatened by my arms or my negotiations. As for my continental system, you perhaps laughed at it." "Sire," replied the colonel, "we affected to do so, but all men of judgment felt the full force of it." "Well," continued the emperor, "I stood alone in my opinion on the continent, and I was forced for the moment to employ violence everywhere. At length my plan began to be understood. The tree already bears its fruit. I made the beginning. Time will do the rest. Had I maintained my power, I would have changed the course of trade and the direction of industry. I had naturalized sugar and indigo in France, and I should have naturalized cotton and many other articles of foreign produce. I should have knocked up the colonies if we had continued to be denied a share of them. With us, the impulse was most powerful. National prosperity and science advanced beyond measure. Yet your ministers proclaimed through all Europe that the French are overwhelmed with misery and were retrograding to a state of barbarism. Thus, the view of our internal prosperity strangely surprised the vulgar mass and even disconcerted the more thinking portion of the European public. The strides of knowledge in France were gigantic. The ideas of the French people were everywhere properly directed and extended. We took pains to render science popular. I was informed that your countrymen were distinguished for their knowledge of chemistry, and yet I will not decide on which side of the water the most able chemists will be found. In France, said the colonel immediately. It is of little importance, continued the emperor, but I maintain that in the mass of the French people there is 10 and perhaps 100 times more chemical knowledge than in England, because the manufacturing classes now employ that science in their daily labor. This was one of the characteristics of my school. Had I been allowed sufficient time, there would soon have been no such thing as trades in France. They would all have been converted into arts. The emperor concluded with these remarkable observations. England and France held in their hands the fate of the world, and particularly that of European civilization. What injury did we not do to each other? What good might we not have done under Pitt's system? We desolated the world, and what has been the result? You imposed on France a tax of 1,500 millions of francs and raised it by means of Cossacks. I laid a tax of 7,000 millions on you and made you raise it with your own hands by your parliament. Even now, after the victory you have obtained, you can tell whether you may not sooner or later sink under the weight of such burden. With Fox's system, we should have understood each other. we could have accomplished and preserved the emancipation of nations, the dominion of principles. Europe would have presented but a single fleet and a single army. We might have ruled the world. We might everywhere have established peace and prosperity, either by dint of force or persuasion. Yes, I repeat, what a mischief have we not done? What good might we not have effected? Never was Napoleon in a more talkative humor. He laughed more than once at the endeavors I made to interpret his observations amidst the volubility with which he uttered them. As for the colonel, he took his leave amazed and confounded by what he had heard. When he was gone, the emperor continued to converse for a long time in the drawing room. He afterwards went into the garden in spite of the bad weather and sent for us all to join him. He was desirous of reading the declarations which we had made. They became the subject of conversation. 4 ships arrived here today from Europe. They had on board the 66th Regiment and had left England before the phaeton, which brought the new governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. After dinner, the emperor good-humoredly related the remark made by an old soldier of the 53rd, who, having seen him yesterday for the first time, went back to his comrades and said, "What lies they told me about Napoleon's age. He is not old at all. The rogue has at least 60 campaigns in his body yet." We thought this expression savored very much of the Frenchman, and we laid claims to it as having proceeded from one of our grenadiers. We then related to him a number of bon mots made by our soldiers during his absence and on his return, with which he was much entertained, but what particularly excited his risibility was the answer made by a grenadier at Lyons. A grand review was held there just after the emperor had landed on his return from Elba. The commanding officer remarked to his soldiers that they were well clothed and well fed, that their pay might be seen upon their persons. "Yes, certainly," replied the grenadier, to whom he addressed himself. "Well," continued the officer with a confident air, "it was not so in Bonaparte. Your pay was in arrears. He was in your debt." "And what did that signify?" said the grenadier smartly, "if we chose to give him credit." The 21st, the emperor sent for me to attend him in the garden about 4 o'clock to act as interpreter. Captain Hamilton, the commander of the frigate Havana, was set to sail the next day for Europe. With his officers, had come to take leave of the emperor. Captain Hamilton spoke French. When I joined the party in the garden, the emperor was expressing himself with warmth. "They wish to know what I desire," said he. "I demand my liberty or my death. Report these words to your Prince Regent. I no longer ask to hear from my son, since they have had the barbarity to leave my first request unanswered. I was not your prisoner. Savages would have had more respect for my situation. Your ministers have basely violated in my person the sacred rights of hospitality. They have forever dishonored England. Captain Hamilton, having ventured to observe that Napoleon was not the prisoner of England alone, but of the allied powers, the emperor warmly resumed, "I did not deliver myself up to Russia. Should I not doubtless have been well received? I did not surrender myself to Austria. There I should have been equally well treated, but I delivered myself up of my own free will and choice to England, because I had confidence in her laws and her public morals. I have been cruelly deceived, but heaven will avenge my wrongs, and sooner or later you will meet the punishment of a deed for which mankind already reproaches you. Repeat all this to the Prince Regent, sir." He accompanied these last words with a motion of his hand and dismissed the captain. We walked about for a few minutes, and on the return of the Grand Marshal, who had accompanied Captain Hamilton a short distance, we thought it would be proper to leave him alone with the emperor. But I had scarcely entered my room when he sent for me. He was alone in his own apartment. He asked me whether I had not had enough of retirement during the day. I told him that a feeling of respect and discretion had alone induced me to leave him. To this he answered that there was no occasion for it, as nothing had passed that he wished to make a secret of. "Besides," added he, "a certain degree of freedom and ease is not without its charm." These words, which fell carelessly from Napoleon's mouth, may better serve to show his character than hundreds of pages. We then perused an English publication containing the official documents found in the portfolio, which was taken from Napoleon at Waterloo. The emperor was astonished himself at the number of orders which he had issued, almost at the same moment, and the countless details which he had directed in every quarter of the empire. This publication said he can do me no harm. After all, it will at least satisfy everyone that its contents are not the production of a sluggard. They will compare me with the legitimate sovereigns, and I shall not suffer by the comparison. After dinner, the emperor conversed on several unconnected subjects, and speaking of his ambassadors, he said he considered Monsieur de Narbonne as the only one who had fully deserved that title and had really fulfilled the duties of his office, and that he said by the peculiar advantages, not only of his talent, but of his old-fashioned morals, his manners, and his name. When an ambassador has merely to prescribe, anyone may fill the post. One person is just as good as another. Perhaps an aide-de-camp is the best man that can be chosen, but when it is necessary to negotiate, the affair is widely different. In that case, it is indispensable to present with the old aristocracy of the courts of Europe only the elements of that aristocracy, which in fact constitutes a sort of Freemasonry. If an Otto or an Andreassi were to enter the saloons of Vienna, there would be a stop to the interchange of opinion. Habitual manners would cease. They would be regarded as intruders and profaners, and the mysteries of diplomacy would be suspended. But how different would it be with Narbonne, possessing the advantages of affinity, sympathy, and identity? A lady of the old nobility, or perhaps resign her person to a plebeian, though she would not discover to him the secrets of the aristocracy. The emperor was much attached to Monsieur de Narbonne, and regretted him deeply. He had made him his aide-de-camp. He observed only because Maria Louisa, through the intrigues of the persons composing her suite, had refused to have him appointed her gentleman of honor, a post for which he was perfectly adapted. Until the period of his embassy, continued the emperor, we had been duped by Austria. In less than a fortnight, Monsieur de Narbonne penetrated all the secrets of the Vienna cabinet, and Monsieur de Metternich was deeply mortified at the appointment. However, by a singular fatality, perhaps, even the success of Monsieur de Narbonne thwarted my views. I found his talent was no less fatal than useful. Austria, thickened designs her guest, threw aside the mask, and took a precipitate step. Had less penetration been evinced on our part, she would have acted with greater reserve and deliberation. She would have prolonged her natural indecision, and in the interim, other chances might have risen up. Someone present, having alluded to the embassies of Dresden and Berlin, and being apparently inclined to attach blame to our diplomatic agents in those courts at the period of the return from Moscow, the emperor replied that period, the fault was not to be attributed to persons, but to things that, with a single glance, anyone might have foreseen what would happen, and that for his part he had not been deceived for a moment. He added that if he had not in person conducted the army back to Vilna and into Germany, it was through the fear of not being able himself to reach France. He wished, he said, to obviate this imminent danger by the boldness of his movements in crossing Germany rapidly and alone. He was, however, on the point of being taken to Silesia, but luckily, said he, the Prussians were deliberating at the moment when they ought to have been acting. Their conduct in this respect was like that which the Saxons observed towards Charles VII, who said when he quitted Dresden on a similar occasion, "You will see that they will hold a consultation tomorrow upon the expediency of having detained me today." Before dinner, the emperor called me into his closet to go over some English exercises with him. He told me he had just been calculating the expenses of his toilet, and that it cost him about 4 Napoleons per month. We laughed at the immensity of the budget. He talked of ordering some clothes, shoes, boots from the tradesmen in Europe who had his measures. I thought this would be attended with serious inconvenience, and after some consideration, we were convinced that this would never be permitted. It is, however, observed the emperor, extremely vexatious to be thus deprived of money, and I wish to come to some settlement on this point. As soon as the bill, which is to determine our situation here, shall be notified to me, I intend to make arrangements for receiving an annual loan of 7 or 8 millions of Napoleons from Eugene. He cannot refuse me. He has received from me perhaps upwards of 40 million, and it would be an insult to his sentiments to doubt his readiness to serve me. Besides, we have long accounts to settle together. I am sure if I had appointed a committee of my counselors of state to draw up a report on this subject, they would have presented me with a balance of at least 10 or 12 millions. On Eugène, at dinner, the emperor asked us some questions respecting the sum necessary to enable a bachelor to live in a European capital, or for the support of a plain family establishment, or the maintenance of a family in a style of elegance. He is fond of these questions and calculations. He treats them with great shrewdness and enters into the most curious details. We each presented our budgets, and we agreed that a residence in Paris would cost 15,000, 40,000, and 100,000 francs. The emperor dwelt much on the prices of various articles, and even on the prices of the same articles as they are charged to different persons and under different circumstances. When I was about to leave the army of Italy, said he, to return to Paris, Madame Bonaparte wrote to inform me that she had furnished in the best possible style a small house that we had in the Rue de la Victoire. The house was not worth more than 40,000 francs, but what was my surprise and vexation to find that the drawing room furniture, which after all appeared to me nothing out of the way, was charged at the enormous rate of between 120 and 130,000 francs. In vain did I remonstrate. I was obliged to pay the amount. The upholsterer showed me the directions he had received, and which required that every article should be the very best of its kind. Everything had been made after new designs, and the designs themselves had been invented expressly for the fitting up of my house. Any judge of the case must have condemned me. The emperor then adverted to the extravagant charges made for the furnishing the imperial palaces and the vast economy which he had introduced in this point. He told us the price of the throne, the imperial ornaments. Nothing could be more curious than to hear him detail these charges together with his own plans of economy. How much I regret not having noted them down at the time. The following particulars will serve to show some of the methods which he adopted for ascertaining the correctness of the accounts that were presented to him. On one occasion, when he returned to the Tuileries, which had been magnificently fitted up during his absence, the individuals who attended him eagerly drew his attention to all the new furniture and decorations. After expressing his satisfaction at everything he saw, he walked up to a window overhung with a rich curtain, and asking for a pair of scissors, he cut off a superb gold acorn which was suspended from the drapery, and coolly putting it into his pocket, he continued his inspection to the great astonishment of all present, who were unable to guess his motive. Some days afterwards, at his levee, he drew the acorn from his pocket and gave it to the individual who superintended the furnishing of the palace. Here, said he, heaven forbid that I should think you robbed me, but someone has doubtless robbed you. You have paid for all this at the rate of 1/3 above its value. They have dealt with you as though you had been the steward of a great nobleman. You would have made a better bargain if you had not been known. The fact was that Napoleon, having walked out one morning in disguise, as he was often in the habit of doing, visited some of the shops in the Rue Saint-Denis, where he priced ornaments similar to that which he had cut from the curtain, and inquired the value of various articles of furniture like those provided for the palace, and thus, as he said, he arrived at the result in its simplest form. Everyone knew his habits in this respect. These, he said, were his grand plans for ensuring domestic economy, which, notwithstanding his extreme magnificence, was carried to the utmost degree of precision and regularity. In spite of his numerous occupations, he himself revised all his accounts, but he had his own method of doing this, and they were always made out to him in their details. He would cast his eye on the first article, sugar for example, and finding some millions of pounds set down, he would take a pen and say to the person who drew up the accounts, how many individuals are there in my household? Sire, so many. And it was necessary to give the answer immediately. And how many pounds of sugar do you suppose they consume per day on average? Sire, so many. He immediately made his calculation, and having satisfied himself, he would give back the paper saying, Sir, I have doubled your estimate of the daily consumption, and yet you are enormously beyond the mark. Your account is faulty. Make it out again, and let me have a greater correctness. This reproof would be sufficient to establish the strictest regularity. Thus he sometimes said of his private as of his public administration, I have introduced such order and employed so many checks that I cannot be much imposed on. If I am wronged at all, I leave the guilty person to settle the matter with his own conscience. He will not sink under the weight of his crime, for it cannot be heavy. The 22nd through the 25th. The weather has been very bad for several days past. The emperor discontinued his morning walks and applied himself with greater regularity to his different occupations. He dictated every morning on the events of 1814. Sir Hudson Lowe came to visit our establishment. He entered my apartment and remained there for a quarter of an hour. He expressed his regret for the inconveniences to which we were exposed and observed that we were lodged in bivouacs rather than apartments. He was right. The pitched paper which had been used for the rooms was already beginning to yield to the effect of the hot climate. When the sun shone, I was stifled, and when it rained, I was inundated. Sir Hudson Lowe said he would give directions for having these evils remedied as soon as possible, and politely added that he had brought with him about 1,500 or 12,000 French volumes, which as soon as they should be arranged, he would feel great pleasure in placing in our service. Racine and Voltaire occupied us for these 2 or 3 evenings. Phedre and Athalie, which were read to us by the emperor, afforded us delightful entertainment, for his observations and commentaries gave twofold interest to what he read. Mahomet was the subject of deep criticism. Voltaire said the emperor, in the character and conduct of his hero, has departed both from nature and history. He has degraded Mahomet by making him descend to the lowest intrigues. He has represented a great man who changed the face of the world, acting like a scoundrel worthy of the gallows. He has no less absurdly travestied the characters of Omar, which he has drawn like that of Cutthroat in a melodrama. Voltaire committed a fundamental error in attributing to intrigue that which was solely the result of opinion. Those who have wrought great changes in the world never succeeded by gaining over chiefs, but always by exciting the multitude. The first is the resource of intrigue and produces only secondary results. The second is the resort of genius and transforms the face of the universe. The emperor, adverting to the truth of history, expressed his disbelief of all that was attributed to Mahomet. He must doubtless have been like all chiefs of sex, said he. The Quran, having been written 30 years after his death, may have recorded many falsehoods. The empire of the prophet, his doctrine, and his mission being established and fulfilled, people might and must have spoken accordingly. Still it remains to be explained how the mighty event, which we are certain did take place, namely the conquest of the world, could have been effected in the short space of 50 or 60 years. By who was it brought about? By the hordes of the desert, who, as we are informed, were few in number, ignorant, unwarlike, undisciplined, and destitute of system, and yet they opposed a civilized world abounding in resources. Fanaticism could not have accomplished this miracle, for fanaticism must have had time to establish her dominion, and the career of Mahomet lasted only 13 years. The emperor conceived that, independently of the fortuitous events by which miracles are sometimes produced, there must have been, in this case, some hidden circumstance which has never been transmitted to our knowledge. He was of opinion that Europe had doubtless sunk beneath the results of some first cause, of which we are ignorant, that the different races of people who suddenly issued from the deserts had perhaps been engaged in long civil wars, in which men of heroic character and great talent might have risen up, and irresistible impulses have been created. In all that relates to Oriental affairs, Napoleon departed materially from the common opinions which are derived from the books usually regarded as authorities. He said that on this subject he entertained ideas peculiar to himself, though perhaps they were not very well defined, and that his Egypt expedition had brought about the result in his mind. But to return to Voltaire, said he, it is astonishing how ill his dramas are adapted for reading, when criticism and good taste are not cheated by pomp of diction and scenic illusion. He immediately loses 1,000%. It will scarcely be believed, continued he, that at the time of the Revolution, Voltaire had superseded Corneille and Racine. The beauties of these two great dramatists lay dormant until the First Consul again ushered them into notice. The emperor spoke truly. It is very certain that when he brought us back to civilization, he at the same time restored us to good taste. He revived our national, dramatic, and lyric chefs d'oeuvre, even those pieces which had been prescribed for political reasons. Thus, Richard Coeur de Lion was again brought upon the stage. though a tender interest had, as it were, consecrated it to the Bourbon. Poor Gretry, said the emperor, had long urged me to permit the performance of the opera. It was rather a dangerous experiment, and a violent uproar was predicted. The presentation, however, went off without any unpleasant circumstance, and I ordered it to be repeated for a week and a fortnight in succession until the public were completely tired of it. The charm being broken, Richard continued to be played like any ordinary piece until the time when the Bourbons in their turn prohibited it because it excited an interest in my favor. This strange vicissitude has, it is said, since been renewed with regard to the drama of Prince Edward the Pretender. The emperor prohibited the piece on account of the Bourbons. The Bourbons have recently prescribed it on account of the emperor. The 26th. I went to pay my first visit to Plantation House. I thought Lady Lowe a pretty and amiable woman, though there was something of the actress about her. Sir Hudson Lowe married a short time before his departure from Europe for the express purpose, it is said, of having his wife to assist him in doing the honors of the colony. I understand this lady was the widow of an officer of the regiment which Sir Hudson Lowe formerly commanded, and the sister of a colonel killed at Waterloo. The governor showed me the most marked politeness and attention. He remarked that we were old acquaintances, that I was not aware of the fact. He said he had been much gratified by the perusal of Monsieur Lesage's atlas, though he had never dreamed that he should one day be introduced to the author. He had first seen the work in Sicily, where he got it smuggled from Naples, and he was inexhaustible in his praises of it. He had frequently read the account of the Battle of Jena with General Blucher at the headquarters, where he was English commissioner during the campaign of 1814. He said he had always admired the liberal expressions and the spirit of moderation and impartiality which were observed towards England, but that at the period when he first examined the work, he had been forcibly struck by some equivocal passages which seemed to breathe hostility or reproach to the individual who then governed us. He then added that he had accounted for these passages at the time by my character and doctrines as an emigrant, but that now he thought it a singular contradiction to find me here in the suite of that individual. Now, we had just been informed that Sir Hudson Lowe was, when in Italy, a kind of head police officer and an active agent of the blank and blank systems. I could not help suspecting that a certain insinuation was intended to be conveyed in these remarks. If this were really the fact, and the emperor entertained no doubt of it, then at least the business was cleverly managed on his part, and had I felt less self-respect than I did, I could have given a smart retort, and the matter might have been carried to some length. I, however, merely replied that he had totally misunderstood the application of the equivocal passages in question, and that they could not have any reference to Napoleon, since I was now attached to his person.